Hi, my name is Mark Carlson. I'm a fly tyer and fly angler. I live in the greater Charleston, South Carolina area. I enjoy fly fishing for redfish, flounder, and sea trout in our estuaries and inshore marshes. Today I'm going to be tying the Schlappy Shrimp for you. This is a pattern I came up with when I found out that Whiting Farms was putting out high quality schlappen. Haven't really seen a high quality schlappen come out before. I found one other company that produces it. I don't recall their name. But these feathers are absolutely gorgeous. Most of the time you buy schlappen, it's all uniform in width and heavily dyed. The Whiting Farms version has a nice taper to it, like most of their feathers. You can get them in grizzly, which I haven't seen before. Now this feather has obviously been dyed, but you can get them in regular grizzly, brown, tan, several other natural colors. The fly we're tying today is tied in several variations. We're going to be tying this version right here today. It's a more natural color. I also tie this color in kind of an electric chicken / tutti frutti kind of pattern. Seems to pick up the redfish well when the water is clear but the skies are overcast. The black is great in muddy water, and the chartreuse, well, it's good all the time. So let's go ahead and get started. Today I'm going to be tying on Mustad's C68 SNP-DT hook. It's a 2x heavy, 2x strong hook in size 1/0. They're very similar to the Gamakatsu SC15 hooks. We'll also be using the schlappen as mentioned before. I'm using Unithread 2/0, 6/0, 6/0 thread and tan. Silly legs in pumpkin and orange. You can use other colors. I really like the brown on this and the orange pop at the end. I'm using a variegated chenille for the body underneath the schlappen. Orange craft fur to give a nice hot spot. On the other varieties of the fly, I'll use different colors. As long as it contrasts with the fly, it gives us a nice little hot spot. Now, whether or not it helps at all with the fish seeing it or anything, I don't really know, but sometimes it can help you spot the fly when you're fishing in good clear water. The main tail portion is pseudo hair, which is a nice soft longer hair. I also sometimes use fin coon for this. So we're going to start off by tying in our thread. Alright, I'm going to tie all the way back to the bend of the hook, and I'm going to go back down the bend just a touch. Alright, I want this fly to ride hook point up, and so tying down the bend kind of gives the features of the head and tail of the fly a nice popped up ride. First thing I'm going to do is I've cut a little clump of the craft fur. This is the butt ends that I used from a previous fly. It's unusual. Most of the time you'd think, oh, we'll tie in like this and get a nice tail. But all we want is a nice little hot spot. So I'm going to trim this kind of even to get the butt size that I want. So there we go. It doesn't need to be much. Just enough to give us a nice little tuft. Okay. And now we're going to tie this in. I'm going to bring the thread up, capture it in my fingers, and then bring it back down. That's going to cinch the hair in, and then I can give it a few good wraps. 3 or 4 should do it. Now I'm going to come back and I'm going to take the scissors and just trim off the long bits here. Wrap over the bitter ends. And now we're going to comb out a nice piece of pseudo hair. Pseudo hair, I find, has a significant amount of underfur, and that I have to clip more than I think I would to get the length and size of a clump that I want. The nice part about this underfur, though, is that if you're tying another pattern that calls for a dubbed underbody, this underfur comes off really nice and fine. Really, you could use this pseudo hair underfur. Excuse me. I'm new to using this material, so I keep on messing up the name. You could really use the pseudo hair underfur as a replacement for the variegated chenille on this if you wanted to. So now that I've combed out a bit, I'm going to go ahead and cut this off of the quote-unquote hide. Now, synthetic materials really tend to dull scissors, so I tend to use just a regular pair of around-the-house scissors for cutting this stuff. They're cheap to replace, and they don't dull. Using them prevents me from dulling up my good tying scissors. And it looks like these scissors have about had it, but we're going to make them work for this last fly. At least this fly. Maybe I'll get a few more out of it. We'll see. Now I've pulled off a bit of this fur, and you can see how much underlayer there is. Now I want a bit more than that. You can see how much underlayer there is. I want a bit more of the longer fibers for this, so I'm going to put this clump down and cut some more off to add to it. I'm finding with this pseudo hair, you really have to kind of play with it to see how much you're going to need to get the tail size that you want on any fly. So that's probably a good size here. So what I'm going to do is pinch the super hair. So there we go again. The pseudo hair in the middle, and I'm kind of trying to just kind of pull out as much of this under fluff as I can from this side. See, it's just coming right out. See how great dubbing this is going to make. I haven't tried using this for the underbody on this fly because I really like that variegated chenille. But if you're on a budget or you have trouble finding that variegated chenille, it'd be great. Just to cut one more material from the fly, etc. Okay, so now I've got a reasonable size clump of the fur. I'm going to go ahead and roughly measure about a shank length and a half, roughly, and I'm going to go ahead and tie that in. Just right on top of that hot spot. Okay, and I really would like a little bit of a large clump on the end here when I'm tying this in initially, because that's going to build a good little base that's going to help us split the eyes here in a minute. I guess I didn't mention I'm using the Enrico Puglisi pre-made shrimp and crab eyes. You can get these at your local fly shop usually if you live in a coastal area or an area that maybe has some warm water faculties to it. Or you can make them yourself. It's really just a piece of monofilament with a colored bud of epoxy on the end. Now I've got starting to build a nice little dam there. I'm going to go ahead and cut off the bitter ends on here. Now that I've cut the large majority off, I'm going to come in here with these tying scissors and try and to just nip them down just a little bit more. Okay. Now, one thing with this fly you can do, tying in some dumbbell eyes, there's two options here. You can tie them in back here at the bend of the hook, or you can tie them up here where you normally would for other style flies. I've tried both. I don't think it makes a whole lot of a difference. I think if you tie them in at the bend, you get a little bit more pop-up on the fly, but since we're tying things in down on the bend a little bit, I don't think it matters. So I'm going to go ahead and move the thread forward to the index point and tie these in. Make sure you don't tie them too close to the hook eye, because we need space to tie off the schlop in and the chenille when we're done, and we're also going to want to add a weed guard. So if you're not familiar with the term index point, it's a term, I guess you could say, that was coined, as far as I'm aware, by Charlie Craven. He's a fly tyer out in Arvada, Colorado, and has tied a number of amazing flies that have made it into various catalogs, but he's most well known for his books on fly tying. He's got really great instruction, and his photography is head and shoulders above most. And it's a real good option for if you're just getting started as far as tying flies go. Just learning basic techniques that can be applied not only to trout flies, which is what he ties primarily out in his neck of the woods, but also in saltwater flies, streamers, bass patterns, you name it. It's really good. Now, before I get too much farther, I'm going to go ahead and pull this pseudo hair up a bit, and we're going to take a brown Sharpie. I've tried other waterproof markers or permanent markers, and they seem to run or just erase completely in the water, but we're just going to bar this hair a bit. It could be the pseudo hair that's having problems keep holding the ink. I don't think so, but I don't have this problem with fin coon. So we're just going to bar this to give it kind of a little natural variegation look. All right, so just like that. Now we can push that back down. Now I'm going to take my pair of eyes, and I'm going to tie in one eye at a time. I really like to use the dumbbells as just a good way to keep the eyes even as we go down the shank a bit. So I'm going to give those only a couple wraps. So when I tie in this second eye, if I need to adjust the length on the eye, it's a lot easier if you only have a couple of wraps. So I'm going to line this up as best I can, and then I'm going to take a few thread wraps. And don't be surprised if your monofilament of the fly eye rolls a little bit. Just push it back into position. We're going to make a few light wraps, and then we're going to start to cinch down. As we come up towards the lump that we created with the pseudo hair and the craft fur, you can see they're going to start to splay a little bit, and that's just right. Okay, we're going to come back down, and I like to tie these in the whole length. It's not absolutely necessary, but I feel like it gives my fly a little bit more body. It gives it a little more thickness, especially if you're tying with maybe a dubbed body or a smaller chenille, or even on a smaller fly. I'm tying this on a 1/0, but I tie another version that I guess I forgot to add in all white, on down to a size 6. Sometimes those redfish get up on those frats, they're eating those grass shrimp, and they get really picky, and you got to have something that's just the right color and just the right size to fool them into taking it. Now that I've got those kind of wrapped in down the length, I'm going to roll this over. I'm going to use those craft scissors to come back in here and trim off the ends of these monofilament, and that'll just go in my little trash pile here. I'm going to mash those back down. They came up a bit when I cut them. Wrap them down a bit more. Now I've developed a nice little base here. before I get too much farther, I'm going to take a little bit of the Solares thin hard formula, and I'm going to just put a bead of it down. This is just going to help secure the body of our fly. Okay, you really don't need much. I put a little dab on like that, and I'm going to use a model builder's paintbrush. These are sold in craft stores, and they're used for doing detail work on model cars and airplanes, etc. But they're also really great for helping spread dye on these little flies like this. It thins this UV out really well. All right. This is an optional step. I really just do it mostly for durability. And now I'll hit it with my UV light for just a few seconds. And that ought to get her done. Alright, now, I forgot to mention earlier, we're going to be using some ultra wire large, in this case gold. The purpose of this is that because the Schlappy stem on the whiting for whiting feathers is somewhat more fragile than the cheaper versions, it does have a tendency to break. I found, not necessarily because of the fish, but when you're trying to get the fly out of the fish's mouth, the last big fish I got on it, didn't see him. He was in very shallow water. He was a 28-inch red, and he was either not moving or moving extremely slowly, and he just kind of slurped the fly in like a little crab. So when I hooked him, the tongue was buried in his tongue, and the using my pliers to get the fly out of his mouth broke the stem of the feather. So I came back after fact and decided my future patterns, I'm going to add this wire to help protect that a little bit. Now I'm going to go ahead and take my feather. We're going to start down at the fatty end. Alright, and you got a little bit of marabou down here. We're going to go ahead and pull that off. And we can start farther down on this feather than we might on other feathers, because if you've got a little bit more marabou-y stuff on one side than the other, that's fine. We're looking for movement in the water, and this Schlappy, it really pulsates. It almost gives kind of a squid type look to the fly. It just pulsates a lot and puts off a lot of vibrations. I guess if I'm really being honest, this is almost a variation on a woolly bugger. So anyhow, we've got our feather prepped. I'm going to tie it in from the base. Now the opposite of a woolly bugger is that you would want the wider end to start at the head and taper down so it doesn't look like a Christmas tree. In this case, because this material is soft, it's not standing up on end, we're going to tie the fatter end in down here. That's going to allow the longer fibers to kind of cover over here and then taper as we get back and still get good action. If we had tied it in up here, any action made by the shorter fibers would be hidden by the longer fibers. So we're going to go ahead and tie this feather in. It doesn't really matter which way you tie the feather in as far as which side's up or down. Once you start turning this feather, it's going to tell you which way it wants to wrap around the shaft. Sometimes it works out for me and wraps the way I want it to, other times it doesn't. You may have noticed that I'm tying left-handed. That's just how it works out for me. I am left-handed. Oh, you know what? We almost forgot to tie in our silly legs. I like to take just one or two legs. Okay. I'm going to pop them off of the band here. I'm going to fold them in half. Now some guys like to wrap them around the thread before they tie them in. I just have a hard time getting that to work for me. So I like to fold them in half like this. And then I want to make sure that you get them hanging down on either side of the fly. just like this. We'll take a few loose wraps and make sure that they're still spread on either side, like we said. Okay, and then we're going to take a few good turns back up to secure them in. And I'm going to continue to hold them down on the sides as I wrap back forward a bit. Bring the thread forward just to kind of help smooth that out a bit. And we'll trim those when we're done. Now we're ready to go ahead and tie in the chenille. Just want to tie in a little nub at the start. Alright, we're going to bring the thread and get some good snug wraps on that. You don't want that coming undone. And then we're going to go ahead and take our thread all the way up to right behind the dumbbell eyes. Now, making sure everything's held back, we're going to go ahead and start wrapping our chenille. You want to make sure you make good touching turns. We don't want to leave any part of that thread body exposed. Alright. I like to make a little figure eight around the dumbbell eyes, just because I do. You can tie it off behind them, you can tie it off in front of them. It doesn't really matter as long as you don't crowd the hook eye and you leave enough space to tie in a weed guard. The weed guards on these flies, we'll talk about a little more in depth later, but even if you're fishing just a basic mud flat that's got a few oysters on it, I've found that oyster flats, even when they've got giant mounds, tend to have individuals that randomly hang out, and anytime you hit an oyster, it has a potential to dull your hook. And the last thing you want to do is have a fish hit your fly and then not get hooked because you got a dull hook. Okay, so we're going to kind of stroke these fibers a bit back as much as we can. They don't really move very well, but that's okay. This feather feels like it's telling me it wants to come down on this side. You got to make sure you don't trap your silly legs as you tie, as you palmer the feather. Okay. Now, one thing we got to do as we move forward is make sure we're brushing these fibers back the entire length. Now we're making loose wraps with the feather. The first couple wraps here, just you can see I'm leaving some gap here because we've got so much fiber here. It's going to get what you want. These silly legs really want to give me a hard time today, it seems. Okay. If you stack this, if you wrap this too compact and make the wrap turns too tightly, it really doesn't work out so well. You get too much density on the fibers, and they don't have the room to breathe like they want them to. Okay, so now we've got a nice body there. I'm going to bring my thread back and tie off right here behind the eyes for the Schlappy. Okay, give it a few good wraps, and we're going to nip off the Schlappy. Now we're left with this finer, thinner section of Schlappy, and that's not going to be useful for tying another one of these, but this would look really great on some bugs for brim, bluegill, shell crackers, red-breasted sunfish, that kind of thing. Might even work well for a small leech pattern for trout. So we're going to hold on to that and just set it aside. Now with the wire, we want to wrap the wire in the opposite direction that we've wrapped the feather. So I'm going to come from the bottom up with this one. And again, we're going to have to be careful not to trap the feather fibers. And I can use my bodkin to kind of pop them out as I go. Get some down here giving me a hard time. I gotta find a nice way to get between them. Again, this is a loose wrap. We're not doing very tight. You just need to protect the stem of the feather. If you trap a couple fibers, it's fine. You can see we've still got plenty of fibers hanging out, sticking up, looking good. I admit I like the way it looks better without the wire, but I would rather have the fly last a few more fish. So I'm going to bring it up here. Now what I do to like to secure it a little bit is just wrap it under the back of the dumbbell eye a little bit while I tie it in. That keeps it a little nice and taut. I'm going to tie it in right here. Now instead of coming in with needle nose or something like that to cut that off, I'm just going to give it a good twist. Spin it around and it'll break right off. Gives us a nice flush point that's not sharp. We can bury that a little bit with our thread. Okay. Now, if for some reason you're in an area that you don't feel like you need a weed guard, that's the gist of the fly. Again, being where I'm at, weed guards are imperative. So I'm going to roll the fly over in my vise. I'm going to adjust it a little bit in the vise so that I can see what I'm doing here. I've got a good, I want the hook to lay kind of flat. Now I like to use 16-pound hard mason for this. A lot of people use 50 or 60-pound regular monofilament. This stuff, I don't know what it was originally intended for. It's some sort of leader material, but it's ridiculous how stiff it is. It's very, very much more stiff even than fluorocarbon. It's got a ton of memory. As you can see, just hanging off, it wants to wrap itself right back around the spool. We're going to cut it off there. You don't need very much. I've got, what, like 2 inches, maybe 1.5 inches, something like that. Now with this stuff, it can make itself a little bit challenging to tie in. There's different ways to tie in a weed guard. I really like to tie it in like this. So I'm going to fold it in half so the ends are about even, and then I'm going to use a pair of really short needle nosers. And I'm just going to crush the line right there at the middle. That's going to help it secure a good tight bend, as you can see. Then I'm going to smash the front, 1/16 of an inch, maybe 1/8 of an inch if you're tying a bigger fly. I'm just going to smash that flat, and guess what? That's going to make this super easy to tie in. So now that I've smashed that, I'm going to put the smash section right there on top of the tied up the head of the fly. And we're just going to go ahead and tie it in. I want to bury this really good in a lot of thread wraps. Alright. Alright, now I'm going to go ahead and whip finish. Give it a good whip finish here. And then we're going to go ahead and hit this with a little bit of UV resin. Again, I'm using the thin version because I want it to penetrate the thread. I'm not looking to build up any kind of structural or cosmetic appearance here. It's just to make sure everything stays nice and tight. Little dab is all it takes. We'll take the little brush again. We're going to spin it around the entire tied off head area. Hit it with the UV light. Okay. Now you can see my weed guard is laid back down a bit. It's okay. Remember, this stuff has ridiculous memory, so all I can really do is fold this over, and now it's going to stand right up. Now I'm just going to kind of measure off, see where I need it, and cut the mason. And there we have it. We're going to come back here. I want to grab my silly legs. I want to kind of trim them to a good length. In this case, it looks like I got a little bit uneven, so we're just going to cut them so they're all roughly the same length. And there we go. And there you have it, folks. The Schlappy Shrimp in a natural color. Working real well down here right now in the cold winter water that is really clear in these marshes. Good luck if you enjoy the fly, tying it on them and using it in the marsh. Let me know in the comments if you have any suggestions or have some good success with it. Thanks. Bye.